Good evening. I have some wonderful stories to tell you tonight. I hope you had a very peaceful and lovely day. I know we did here at Lotus Lake. This is, I'm reading from Stories of God by Rainer Rilke, one of my favorite writers, and I hope you will enjoy it also. This story is called The Stranger. In a way, it's a pity to start a good story because, especially a short story, that it's over very soon, and then we have read it and we can't read it again for the first time. So I'll try to. Maybe you relate to that, maybe not. The Stranger. A stranger has written me a letter. Not of Europe. Not of Europe has the stranger written me, nor of Moses, nor of the great or small prophets, nor of the Emperor of Russia, nor of the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, his dreadful ancestor. Not of the mayor or of our neighbor the cobbler, not of the nearby town, not of the far towns, and even the forest with the many deer in which I lose myself every morning, is not mentioned in his letter. He tells me nothing either about his dear mamma or about his sisters, who have probably married long ago. Perhaps his dear mamma is dead. How else could it be that a 4-page letter I find her nowhere mentioned? He shows a much, much greater confidence in me. He makes me his brother. He tells me of his need. In the evening, the stranger comes to see me. I light no lamp. I help him off with his coat and beg him to drink tea with me, for it is just the hour at which I daily drink my tea. And on such intimate visits, one needs feel no constraint. As we are about to sit at the table, I notice that my guest is restless. His face is full of anxiety, and his hands tremble. "Oh, yes," said I, "here is a letter from you. Excuse me, here is a letter for you." And then I began to pour the tea. "Do you take sugar? And lemon, perhaps? In Russia, I learned to drink tea with lemon. Will you try?" Then I light a lamp and place it in a far corner, rather high, so that twilight really remains in the room. Only a somewhat warmer twilight than before, a rosy twilight. And therewith my guest's face too seems more certain, warmer, and by far more familiar. I welcome him once more with the words, "You know, I have been expecting you for a long while." And before the stranger has time to be astonished, I explain, "I know a story which I can tell no one but you. Do not ask me why. Only tell me whether your chair is comfortable, whether the tea is sweet enough, and whether you want to hear the story." My guest had to smile. Then he said simply, "Yes." To all 3 questions, yes? To all 3. We both leaned back at the same moment in our chairs, so that our faces became shadowy. I put my tea glass down, rejoiced at the golden glint of the tea, slowly forgot this joy again, and asked suddenly, "Do you still remember God?" The stranger reflected. His eyes looked deep into the dark, and with the little points of light in the pupils, they resembled 2 long, arbored walks in a park, over which summer and sun lie luminous and broad. These 2 began so, with round twilight, stretching in ever-narrowing obscurity back to a distant shimmering point, the exit on the far side into perhaps much brighter day. While I was realizing this, he said, hesitating, and as though he were only reluctantly using his voice, "Yes, I still remember God." "Good," I thanked him, "for it is with him that my story deals. But first tell me, do you sometimes talk to children?" "Well, it does happen, just in passing. At least, perhaps you know that God, in consequence of some horrid disobedience of his hands, does not know what a finished man really looks like." "I heard that somewhere once, but I can't recall from whom," my guest replied, and I saw uncertain memories fleeting across his brow. "No matter," I broke in. "Listen to the story. A long time ago, God endured this uncertainty, for his patience is as great as his strength. Once, however, when dense clouds had laid between him and the earth for many days, so that he hardly knew any more whether he had not merely dreamed everything, the world and men and time, he called his right hand, which had so long been banished from his sight and hidden in small, unimportant works. It came willingly, for it believed that God wanted at last to forgive it. When God saw it there before him in its beauty, youth, and strength, he was indeed inclined to forgiveness. But he remembered in time and commanded without looking at it, "You are to go down to earth. You are to take on the form you will see there among men, and to stand naked upon a mountain so that I can observe you closely. As soon as you arrive below, go to a young woman and say to her, but very gently, 'I want to live.' At first there will be a little darkness about you, and then a great darkness, which is called childhood. And then you will be a man and climb the mountain as I have commanded you. All this will, of course, last but for a moment. Farewell." The right hand then took leave of the left, called it many gracious names. Indeed, it had even been declared that it suddenly bowed down before it and said, "Hail, Holy Ghost." But here St. Paul stepped up and smote off God's right hand, and an archangel caught it up and bore it away under his wide mantle. But God held the wound to his left hand so that his blood should not stream over the stars and thence fall down in sorrowful drops upon the earth. A short time after, God, watching attentively all that went on below, saw that certain men in iron garments were busying themselves about one mountain more than all others. And he expected to see his hand climb up there, but there came only a man in, it seems, a red cloak, who was dragging upwards some black swaying thing. At the same instant, God's left hand, lying over his open wound, began to grow restless, and suddenly, before God could prevent it, it left its place and rushed about madly among the stars, crying, "Oh, poor right hand, and I cannot help you." Therewith it tugged hard at God's left arm, at the extremity at which it hung, trying to tear itself free. And the whole earth was red with God's blood, and it was impossible to see what was happening beneath it. At that time, God had very nearly died. With a last effort, he called his right hand back. It came pale and trembling and lay down in its place like a sick animal. And even the left hand, which already knew a good deal, since it had recognized the right, down on the earth as it toiled up the mountain in a red cloak could not learn from it what it had further happened on that hill. It must have been something terrible. For God's right hand has not yet recovered from it and suffers under its memories no less than under the ancient wrath of God, who has still not yet forgiven his hands. My voice took a little rest. The stranger had covered his face with his hands. Thus everything stayed for a long time. Then the stranger said in a voice I had long known, "And why have you told me this story?" Who else would have understood it? You come to me without rank, without office, without temporal honors, almost without a name. It was dark as you came in, yet I noticed in your features a resemblance. The stranger looked up questioningly. Yes, I answered his silent gaze. I often think perhaps God's hand is again on its way. The children have heard this story, and evidently it was told them in such a way that they could understand everything. For they are very fond of this story. The just previous story, which was the first one in this book, was very hard to understand. But I am thinking now that there may be something more to this than the confusion we were left with at the end of the first story. So this is the stranger. I'll leave it up to you to decide what it means. And I'd like to go on to another story. I think we have plenty of time. This one is called, this is the third story in the book. This is called Why God Wants Poor People. A very odd title. Let's see what it says. The foregoing story has spread so far and wide that the good schoolmaster goes about town looking very much pained. I can understand that. It is always bad for a teacher when the children suddenly know something which he has not told them. The teacher should, so to speak, be the only hole in the fence through which one can see into the orchard. If there are other holes too, the children will press around a different one every day and will soon tire of the view anyhow. I would not have drawn this comparison here, for perhaps not every teacher would agree to being a hole. But the schoolmaster of whom I speak, my neighbor, heard the comparison from me first and moreover considered it extremely apt. And even if somebody should think otherwise, the authority of my neighbor is decisive for me. He stood before me, fidgeted constantly with his glasses, and said, I don't know who told the children this story, but in any case, it's not right to overload and strain their imagination with such extraordinary notions. The story in question is a kind of fairy tale. I happen to have heard it, I interrupted. I was not lying, for since that evening it really had been repeated to me by the lady next door. So, said the schoolmaster. That seemed to him easily explicable. And what do you think of it? I hesitated, and he very quickly went on, too. In the first place, I think it's wrong to treat religious, especially biblical subjects in a free and arbitrary manner. At any rate, it has all been so expressed in the Catechism that it could not be better said. I was about to comment, but remembered just in time that the good schoolmaster had used in the first place, so that now, according to the syntax and for the health of his sentence, there must follow a then, and perhaps even a and finally. ere I might permit myself to add something. And so it happened. As the schoolmaster had also delivered this very sentence, the faultless construction of which will delight every connoisseur, to others who would be of no better able than I to forget it, I will here record only that which came, like the finale of some overture, after the beautiful preparatory words, and finally, letting pass the very fantastic conception, it seemed to me the content hasn't even been sufficiently explored and considered from every angle. If I had time to write stories, you miss something in this particular story? I could not refrain myself from interrupting. Yes, I miss a good deal. From the literary critical point of view, as it were, if I may speak to you as a colleague, I did not understand what he meant and said modestly, "You are too kind, but I have never done any teaching." Suddenly a thought struck me. I broke off, and he continued somewhat coolly. To take just one instance, it is not to be assumed that God, if one wants to go so far into the meaning of the story, that is, that God, I say that God should have made no further attempt to see man as he is. I mean, now I thought I should propitiate the good schoolmaster again. I made a little bow and began. Everybody knows that you have devoted yourself wholeheartedly, and if one may say so, not without finding reciprocal affection, to a close study of the social question. The good schoolmaster smiled. Well, then I may assume that what I now propose to tell you will not be altogether remote from your interest, especially as it enables me to link up with your last, very perspicacious remark. He looked at me with astonishment. You wouldn't mean that God— Indeed, I confirmed, God is just on the point of making a new attempt. Really? The schoolmaster rebuked me. And is that known to the authorities? As to that, I can't tell you anything definite, said I regretfully. I am not in touch with those circles, but if you nevertheless want to hear my little story, you would be doing me a great favor. The schoolmaster took off his spectacles and carefully polished the lenses, while his naked eyes seemed to be ashamed. I began. Once God was looking down into a great city. As his eyes wearied of all the confusion, to which the networks of electric wires contributed not a little, he decided to limit his gaze for a while to a single tall apartment building, as this was far less taxing. Simultaneously, he remembered his old wish to see a living man, and to this end his glances dove into the windows of each story in turn, from the lowest up. The people on the first floor, a rich merchant and family, were almost all clothes. Not only that all parts of their bodies were covered with costly stuffs, the outlines of this apparel were in many places so formed that one saw there could no longer be a body underneath. On the second floor, it was not much better. The people who lived on the third floor had distinctly fewer clothes on, but were so dirty that God discerned only grave furrows, and in his goodness was all ready to command that they should be fruitful. At last, in a little slanting room under the roof, God found a man in a shabby coat who was busy kneading clay. "Oh-ho, where did you get that?" he cried. The man did not even take his pipe from his mouth, growling, "The devil knows where. I wish I had become a cobbler. Here I sit and worry." And ask what God might, the man was in a bad humor and gave no more answer. Until one day he got a large letter from the mayor of that town. Then, unasked, he told God everything. He had had no commission for so long. Now suddenly he was to make a statue for the public park, and it was to be called Truth. The sculptor worked day and night in a distant studio, and to God came various old memories as he saw this. Had he not still been angry with his hands, he too would surely have begun to make something again. But as the day came when the statue that was called Truth was to be carried out to its place in the gardens, where God too could have seen it in its perfection, a great to-do arose, for a commission of city fathers, schoolmasters, and other influential personalities had demanded that the figures should first be partially clothed before the public viewed it. God did not understand why. So loudly did the sculptors swear. City fathers, schoolmasters, and the rest it was who brought him to this sin, and God will surely, but you are coughing terribly. It will pass, said my schoolmaster in a perfectly clear voice. Well, I have but a little more to tell you. God let go the apartment house and the public park and intended to withdraw his gaze entirely, as one pulls a fishing rod out of the water with a swing to see if anything had bitten. This time something actually hung there, a little tiny house with several people in it, who all had very little on, for they were very poor. These, I believe, are already very poor, but I will make them so poor that they haven't even a shirt to put on. This God undertook to do. Here I made a full stop in my talk to indicate that I had come to an end. The good schoolmaster was not satisfied with that. He found the story just as little finished and rounded off as the preceding. Yes, I excused myself. A poet ought to get hold of that story and invent some sort of fantastical ending, for in fact, it has no end yet. How so? Queried the good schoolmaster, and looked at me expectantly. But my dear Mr. Schoolmaster, I reminded him, how forgetful you are. Are you not yourself a director of our local charities? Yes, I have been for some 10 years, but that's just it. You and your society have been preventing God for the longest time from attaining his object. You clothe the people. Oh, don't mention it, said the schoolmaster modestly. That is simply charity, love of one's neighbor. It is, of course, pleasing to God in the highest degree. Ah, and of that they are quite convinced in authoritative circles? I asked guilelessly. Naturally we are. In my capacity as member of the board of directors of the local charities, not a little praise has come to my ears. I'll tell you in confidence that when the next promotions take place, my activities in this field, you understand? The good schoolmaster blushed bashfully. Accept my best wishes, I responded. We shook hands, and the worthy man went on his way with such proud, measured steps that I'm sure he must have been late for school. as I learned later, a part of this story, insofar as it is suitable for them, became known to the children after all. Would the good schoolmaster have composed an ending for it? I love that story. Next time, we continue Stories of God by Rilke. Thank you for joining me. Be happy. Many blessings from Lotus Lake. Good night.